Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's TTAC webinar titled Play Therapy and Trauma, Foundational Principles, Practices, and Modifications in Methodology. My name is Kevin Sanchez, and I'm McSilver's Program Coordinator for TTAC. A few logistics about today's webinar before our presenters begin. As we've done in the past, this webinar is being recorded and will be posted along with the slides to the TTAC website. Additionally, you'll be receiving an email notifying you that these resources are available. We will be taking questions throughout the webinar, and we ask that you chat in your questions using the chat box functionality by selecting all panelists on the dropdown. We will set time aside at the end of today's webinar to address these questions. For those LMSWs, LSCWs, and LMHCs interested in obtaining CEUs, you will be eligible to receive 1.5 CEUs for attending this webinar. If you're only joined by the phone, we would need you to log on onto the Zoom platform via computer in order to obtain credit for the CEUs. Further information and instructions will be distributed via email following the webinar. Finally, towards the end of the webinar, we will be sending out our feedback survey using the chat box functionality. We ask that you click the link that is shared in the chat box and complete the feedback survey. We appreciate you filling this out as it allows us to understand your experience and enhance our future TTAC offerings. And with that, I want to thank you for joining us, and I'll hand it over to Evelyn Blank, the Associate Executive Director at the New York Center for Child Development and Director of TTAC.
Thank you so much, Kevin, and welcome everyone to part 2 of Play Therapy and Trauma. And for those who may have missed the first session, I encourage you to go to our website, which I'll show you the link in a minute, ttacny.org, and really view both the slide presentation as well as the recording. So welcome, and I'm pleased just to take a moment to tell you who we are. The New York City Early Childhood Mental Health Training and Technical Assistance Center, otherwise known as TTAC, is funded through Thrive NYC in partnership with the New York City Department of Health and Mental Hygiene. TTAC is a partnership between the New York Center for Child Development and the McSilver Institute on Poverty Policy and Research. New York Center has been a major provider of early childhood mental health services in New York, with expertise in informing policy and supporting the field of early childhood mental health through both training and direct practice. NYU McSilver Institute for Poverty Policy and Research houses the Community and the Managed Care Technical Assistance Centers, otherwise known as CTAC and MTAC, which offer clinic, business, and system transformation support statewide to all behavioral health providers. TTAC is tasked with building the capacity and competencies of mental health and early childhood professionals through ongoing training and technical assistance. And if we go to the next slide, you'll see a screenshot of our website where I would encourage people to go to get webinars and recordings of past presentations along with the PowerPoints, and also to see upcoming events. So it is now my privilege to introduce our 2 co-presenters. First, Dr. Gilbert Foley, who's been a very long-term colleague and also a personal mentor of mine. He's the clinical co-director for the Training and Technical Assistance Center at the New York Center for Child Development, and also consulting clinical psychologist at NYCCD for over 20 years, where he also serves on the advisory board. He's also Professor Emeritus with the Graduate Program in Infant Mental Health and Developmental Practice at Adelphi University. He is a retired tenured faculty member of Furkhoff Graduate School of Psychology, where he taught for 20 years in the Department of School Clinical Child Psychology and coordinated the Infancy Early Childhood track. He was director of a federally funded training and technical assistance project that prepared infant and early childhood professionals across the nation. He's the author of several books and numerous articles. His most current book was with Dr. Jane Hockman, Mental Health and Early Intervention, published by Brooks, and he's currently co-authoring Sensory Integration and Self-Regulation in Young Children, which is going to be published by 0 to 3. And for those who are interested, he will also be presenting with his co-author on the 23rd of June around the content in that book. So please go to our website. You can see the announcement and register for that event as well. We also will be sending out a link when the book is released for people to be able to purchase it and to learn more. So, and Dr. Foley also lectures and consults widely. I'm also joined by Dr. Erica Willheim, who's another long-term colleague. We're very fortunate these long-term connections and who I've worked in various capacities over the years. She's Research Assistant Professor at the Child Study Center in the Department of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry at NYU School of Medicine. She's an instructor on the faculty of the Institute for Parenting at Adelphi University and a nationally endorsed trainer in child parent psychotherapy, otherwise known as CPP. Dr. Willheim's clinical and research areas of focus are early childhood mental health and trauma, post-traumatic stress disorder in parents and young children, the intergenerational transmission of trauma, and the specific impact of domestic violence exposure on young children and caregivers. She's also done CPP with fathers that engage in abusive partner relationships. She has over 20 years experience working in a broad range of New York City settings with high-risk young children, adolescents, adults, and families, particularly those involved in the criminal justice and child welfare systems who has suffered violent trauma exposure. So it is now my privilege to turn it over to our co-presenters, and I wanted to remind people that the PowerPoint and the recording will be posted on our website, and that we also will be taking questions throughout the webinar. So thank you, and I turn it over to our co-presenters.
Thank you so much, Evelyn. I will speak for Dr. Foley, we are really happy to be here today and talking about this topic. Our agenda for today, just to give you a sense of where we're going, the roadmap, is that we're going to talk about really some of the core components of play therapy. So we're going to address the therapeutic context, in other words, what settings, what materials, introducing yourself as the therapist. We're going to discuss the working alliance and the use of self. We're going to talk about eliciting material in play therapy, and then managing some of the challenges: resistance, aggression, dysregulation, anxiety, fear. We're going to talk about transference a little bit, and interpretation, and what we call working through, and termination. And then there will be some conversation about trauma play therapy laced in between these topics. And then at the end, we're going to talk very specifically about some issues in trauma play therapy. So in other words, non-directive versus directive intervention, interpretation of traumatic material, and transference when you're doing dyadic multi-generational treatments. I think it's probably fair to say that you will not know how to do play therapy after 90 minutes. But what we really hope is that this will be interesting and stimulating. And some people it will be a refresher, and for some people it will be new information that they really want to learn more about. So I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Foley now to begin.
Thank you, Erica. Well, to begin, I think a very important point of Anna Freud is that the aim of therapy with children is to awaken the urge to complete development. And I think what that speaks to is that everything we're talking about is really rooted in our understanding of developmental processes. And because we know so many problems derail development, the aim is to activate it and mobilize it forward. And I hear my colleague, Dr. Serena Wieder, exhorting us to put development back into infant mental health. So we're going to talk a little bit to start about the actual playroom itself. And I've actually, as I've thought about this, I'd love to be talking to people who are doing treatment now on Zoom, because you're not actually working in a playroom. But of course, traditionally, we work in a space. And the space is actually, I think, a very important part of the work, because it is a secure base. It's a miniature world. And I think to think of the playroom as a container for the feelings, a container for the impulses, and a container really for behavior that may be tolerated in the playroom, but will not be tolerated in the external world. And so helping the child to be able to contain those feelings and those impulses within the context of the playroom, I think is a very, very important part of the work. So the actual physical space is an important dimension. Again, these slides are very dense, so I will try to address the most salient points. The last one is a little technique that I have found very, very helpful. And that is for each child in therapy to have their own little box with their name on it. And children can choose as they make things that might be important to them, or things they write, or pictures they draw, they can choose to put it in their box. And what's nice about that is that you can return to this box of treasures, and it gives you a way to review what's happened, where we are, and where we're going. So I'm not going to say too much about the playroom itself. Certainly, something that I have found helpful, and Erica is going to talk about, is having sensory materials in the playroom. And we've typically always had blocks, water, paint, and clay. But having things like therapy balls and bean bags and Lycra body socks, because of course we know children speak through their bodies. And by having these kinds of sensory motor opportunities and equipment in the playroom gives them, I think, a very, very important avenue of expression and discharge. So this is Erica's slide of a child in a body sock, hiding and also, of course, doing what our OT colleagues call heavy work, pushing against it, and so on and so forth. So again, blocks, I think, are very, very important, and really wooden blocks, because it's important that children heft the object and have some weight to them. Obviously, we want figures that represent heroes and good and bad and aggression, such as soldiers. Puppets are very important. Blankets, you can do amazing things with blankets. And one of them is sometimes children will just put it over a table and turn it into a tent. And it gives them a place to play, often about thoughts and dreams and scary things in the night. You can look through this. A doctor kit, of course, is always very important, since we know that in preschool children, a fear of bodily injury is the primary anxiety of the age. I just want to say that when we're really talking about this kind of traditional psychodynamic play therapy, it's most applicable, of course, to children who have the capacity for symbolic play. So we're really talking 3 to 5 mostly. That is a prerequisite for this kind of treatment modality.
Okay, so I'm going to jump in here and just talk a little bit about, in addition to the toys that were on the previous slide, from a trauma point of view, and this is a trauma toy list borrowed from Child Parent Psychotherapy, we think of it, so for example, Dr. Foley was talking about good and bad. Well, and in trauma work, we graduate from good and bad into the aggressor and the victim. And so it's really important to have animal families, for example, to have carnivores that have teeth, to have plant-eating species, giraffes, zebras, cows. You need to have a kind of predator-prey dynamic be able to be played out. We also like for example, in CPP to have dinosaurs that are actually maybe larger in scale than the animal families because of the representation of larger and bigger and scarier. Food and dishes, and this was also on the previous slide, are incredibly important because they are an opportunity to play out nurturance, which would be, through normative play therapy as well. And then the very special and different thing that trauma treatment does is that we really need to make sure that we have toys that are evocative of the child's particular traumatic experience. So we want to have police cars and ambulances and fire trucks, or any other thing that might be representative for the child, and also medical kits. So we talked about that. So just a sense of how we view toys with a trauma lens as well.
So some basic principles about introducing yourself as a therapist. Again, this is not meant to be a manualized, but just some suggestions. I'm someone who helps boys and girls with their worries, feelings, and fears, and helps them to grow up. I think the helping to grow up dimension is a very important part, because obviously there are some children who are quite frightened of growing up, and some children who resent being a child. and really want to enjoy the privileges of an adult. One of the ideas I would like to share with you, because traditional play therapy, psychodynamic play therapy, is an interpretive methodology. And so I have found it very successful to introduce to the child very early that I will be making interpretations. And this is one way I communicate it. I'll sometimes make guesses about what I think you might be trying to tell me or what your play is about. I won't always get it right. I won't always be right about my guesses, and you can tell me what you think. So the idea that the child, children, of course, will often resist interpretations because they're frightening or threatening, but to introduce early that this is something that's going to happen. And then some basic rules, I think, in most playrooms, that you cannot hurt yourself or me or anybody. You cannot break the toys or spoil the room on purpose. We cannot touch one another in places that are private. And then this idea that of confidentiality, right? What you say and do here is only for us and no one else. But I will talk to your parents about general things, such as he likes to play about hiding and finding and wants to be sure no one will leave him. But I won't tell exactly what you say or do unless it is to protect you from hurting yourself or others. I will talk with your parents so they can help you with growing up. So the kind of therapy that I'm going to be talking about has traditionally been individual therapy. And more often than not, there's collateral sessions with the parent once or twice a month, but it is not traditionally dyadic treatment. And I am going to be referring to a case periodically through the discussion. This is a real case of a 5-year-old boy who, an only child, who presented with a symptom of a phobic symptom of being frightened on going to the bathroom and sitting on the toilet because he imagined that a shark would come up out of the toilet and bite him. So I'll use little bits and pieces of that case to illustrate as we go forward. So the working alliance is absolutely fundamental. I mean, we know children do not refer themselves for treatment. Someone brings them. And of course, the working alliance also has to include the parent, because the parent obviously is the one who brings the child to treatment. So a very broad brush look of the working alliance is the composite of all the factors that keep the child in treatment, in which enable him to remain there during phases of resistance and when the child might be having negative feelings and associations. I think really one of the several most powerful forces that will hopefully keep children in treatment, one is that they feel uniquely understood, understood in a way that is possibly different than anywhere else. At some point, the child will become aware of their own problem and realize that it is stressful. And this hopefully will also motivate the child to stay in treatment. And of course, the positive tide of the therapist is important. Wanting to please the therapist, although that's a little dangerous because that can turn into a defense as well, and the child not wanting to tell you things for fear you won't like them. But remember that we as therapists are often new objects for the child. We relate to them in new ways, in ways that are different. And what does that mean? That we're fully available, we're respectful, we listen, and we exercise unconditional positive regard. And I will sometimes say to a child, you're important, and I will listen to what you have to say and be here and pay attention to what you show me in your play. So as therapists, we use ourselves. I often make the analogy that All the other players in the orchestra have an instrument, but the singer only has their own voice, and we're a little bit like the singers. So we have to use ourselves, and we're the vehicle of treatment. So, of course, one of the most important things is to be fully present. Fred Rogers said, more and more, I've come to understand that listening is one of the most important things we can do for one another. Being there, being fully present, though, means also being able to understand and interpret explicitly what one's own and others' behavior as an expression of mental states, feelings, thoughts, fantasies, beliefs, and desires. Of course, we're not mind readers, but we know reflective function is part of the human spectrum, and it is thought that it is an inherent capacity, not always realized, but inherent capacity, which helps us to understand the world through the views of the child. Of course, in many cases, we try to provide the child with a corrective emotional experience. And often that is the case when there's been trauma, is to provide them a relationship or experiences that kind of transform and balance the negative into the positive. So the therapist as a container, which really comes from the Kleinians, I think is a very, very important part, meaning we have to hold strong feelings. We have to be able to tolerate them without excessive reaction or retaliation. It's a very important message we send to the child because it communicates to them that big feelings will neither damage them nor us as the therapist, and that big feelings can be managed and they won't scare us off. And I again refer to Fred Rogers, who said, if it's mentionable, it's manageable. And that's really what we want to communicate to the child, that their feelings and their fears and their impulses are manageable parts of them.
So one of the things that happens to the use of the self when you're doing trauma work is that you have an exposure level to things that are horror, that are things that are really bad. And this is where we get the concepts of vicarious trauma, secondary trauma, because we spend all our time hearing horror stories, as I like to call them. When you're working in early childhood and early childhood mental health where there has been trauma, you have sort of several layers of what you are containing. There's the horror of the bad thing that happened. There's the fact that it was done to a very small person, which pretty uniformly is more difficult for people to imagine and tolerate when little people who are vulnerable have been hurt. And then in addition to that, little children have very strong primitive feelings. They love, they hate, they cry, they scream, right? It's all very intense and primitive. And then if you add the layer of a trauma-associated, overwhelming primitive feelings, you are in a space with a lot of strong affect, but you're also in a space of these stories that are nightmare stories, that are horror stories. And so part of the container work that we must do with ourselves, and this is where reflective supervision is so crucial, is that we feel things like sadness and helplessness and hopelessness and anger and rage and frustration, and we become overwhelmed or we just feel painful. These are things that make it much more difficult, but makes it very difficult to do this kind of work. And we will talk later about the notion of bearing witness. But a very powerful CPP concept is the idea of sitting with suffering and holding hope. And what does it take for us to be able to do that? What do we have to do our work with self in order to be in the room to bear witness?
So as we know, children don't come like adults and start to tell us in detail their problems. So we have to elicit the material. And of course, fundamental is that we follow the child's lead and the child's intent. And of course, it's play, which is this important intermediate step between enacting without control and ultimately putting into words as a precondition for controlling thought. So play itself, as we talked in the first session, is of course a very, very powerful form of communication. It's a communicative system. And we are attentive to the nonverbal, which includes, of course, drawing, dramatization, and again, direct expression through motor activity and a conveying meaning in motor activity. One of the most important dimensions in this kind of work is to promote projection. We can't always know the content of a child's mind, and the child most likely isn't going to tell us. But children will tell us when they communicate about various experiences that might be very, very ambiguous, for example. So we want to create situations where the child has to sort of fill in the blanks, where the information isn't so evident, where we ask the child to tell us more, where we ask the child to imagine. So we do a lot of wondering. We ask the child to show us. You may be familiar with the squiggle game of Winnicott, where the child draws or a therapist draws a squiggle, and you ask the child, what could it be? Can you make it something? And of course, what the child makes it and how the child elaborates on what they've made tells us something about the content of their mind that they're not telling us directly. One little strategy that's sometimes very helpful is that if a child's playing with some toys and you might want to say to a toy, oh, I think you're trying to tell me something. Let me see if I can listen to you. I don't know what you're quite saying to me. Maybe you can tell me. And then, of course, the child hopefully will fill in the blanks for us and communicate. Now, in this kind of work, we stay in the metaphor of the play. This is an important idea. In other words, we don't talk typically directly to the child. We talk through the play action, through the play figures, through the puppets, through the toys. Because to go directly to the child in this model would be thought to be often too threatening and then would raise resistance. So resistance, we expect resistance. Most of us don't really want to, in some ways, want to change. There's a real investment in our old patterns and in our own thoughts. But the common element in all resistance is holding something back or unconsciously wanting to shut something out of awareness, to not face as Alicia says, the unsayable. So how do we sometimes make it safer for a child to talk about that which is difficult to talk about? So often we use the third person. Many boys and girls are some of the times afraid to go to the toilet and have worries. I once knew a child who we may talk through, again, the tuppet or the toy. If we do make an interpretation, sometimes we hold the child in a sense. I know this might make you angry. I'm not scolding you, but again, a way to get to material in a way that isn't going to be injurious in a way to the child, at least psychologically felt to be intrusive. We might refer to a part of the child. I think the little boy part of you doesn't like to know about the angry feelings inside. So we also talk about the interpretation of the resistance or the defense. Every time I talk about your visits to your mom, you cover your ears. And sometimes we anticipate when there will be resistance. You didn't like what I said to you today, and you may say inside, I don't want to go there and play again. I would rather go outside with my friends to play. But it's your time, and I will be here waiting for you. So, of course, aggression is an expected part of all of us. And how do we sometimes manage aggression? One powerful way is to displace it, to take the aggressive and find a more appropriate aim or a more appropriate object for the aggression. You want to bite me, but you can't. You can bite the pillow and talk about being angry with me. So we don't forbid impulses and strong feelings, but we try to help the child to direct those and redirect the aim of them. Sometimes we try to identify the real object of the child's anger because it's too frightening. The child who may be very angry at the sister, but it's really a displacement for their fear for mom. It's naughty mama, not your baby sister Jane, maybe, that you're angry at. And I just want to make a point of destruction repair play is a very, very powerful kind of play, because we know young children are often very frightened of their own aggression, frightened that it will do harm to them and frightened that it will do harm to others. And so play that allows them to build and knock down and then build again becomes a way for them to learn that these impulses are, again, manageable. Of course, setting limits is sometimes a necessary thing in play therapy. These are just some suggestions of ways of setting limits with a child. Again, these are pertinent, again, children who are symbolic and verbal, because much of this has a strong language loading. I know you're only trying me out, so tell me what you want me to do next. I know you're trying me out, you're testing me, but I can tell you that I will just have to stop you like mommy does. How far do you want me to let you go? We both know I'll have to stop you at some time. And something I've often said to children, you know, I think you can be the boss of yourself and keep your body still and stop throwing. But if you can't, then I will have to help you to stop so you're safe and I'm safe. But believing in the child and believing in the child's own capacity to regulate their own impulses. Resistive materials are very, very important form of displacement, you know, pounding a workbench, diving into a beanbag chair, pushing against that lycra, a body sock. So the importance of resistive materials, and sometimes actually bringing in regulation games. Simon says statues, start, stop, loud, soft, can actually be sort of semi-structured activities that one might bring into the playroom and to help the child when they are dysregulated by any number of feelings.
Okay, so I'm going to jump back in here on the topic of dysregulated children, because we spent a lot of time on that in the first webinar, talking about how dysregulation is a real problem when you are working with children who have experienced trauma. And I wanted to just quickly introduce Bruce Perry's model of, well, the theory is developmental trauma, but the treatment is what he calls neurosequential. And it is his idea that developmental trauma is occurring in the body. And you've heard this from Bessel van der Kolk, and you've heard it from Pat Ogden, you've heard it from lots of people. And that really there's a kind of implicit memory that gets laid down. And the way that Perry looks at this is that the brain works, it's sort of additive, goes up the brainstem, the cerebellum, the limbic and section, and the cortex. And I'm just showing you this picture, not because we are going to learn all about Bruce Perry's theories today, but because I just wanted to give you a visual of his concept that a lot of trauma symptoms live here in the brainstem. And that the idea that you would go and talk to a child, just use words and deal sort of just up here in cortex land, cerebral cortex, is not, that's not going to help because the child is truly dysregulated at a fundamental physiological level. So his notion is that you go from the bottom up, and that it's a sequential approach to treatment, and you have to assess where the child is Are they actually reasonably, their heart rate isn't too high, they are breathing, reasonably comfortably, but they're having big feelings. So we're not here to learn this, but this is why I bring it up here, is that Perry and Vanderkolk and Ogden, they've all talked about the importance of somatosensory activity. And so just now, Dr. Foley is talking about sensory materials that you might have in your playroom. Well, I would argue that for children who have experienced trauma, this is even more crucial and more critical, because you really do need to decrease arousal before making brilliant interpretations. And when they talk about this, they talk about patterned, repetitive, rhythmic somatosensory activity. I'll give you a quick example. I had a kid actually who was 10, and I was doing individual trauma treatment with him. And he came in and he said, I can't talk today. I can't tell you what happened. Something bad had happened. And I took his arms in my arms, and we did like a pull, push kind of thing back and forth with our hands and our arms, and just did it sort of rhythmically for a minute. And I said to him, can you tell me what happened today? And right there, yes, I went to, right, he immediately was now able to talk. So all kinds of things, singing, dancing, drumming, equine assisted therapies, hip hop. Anyway, so if you are interested in this, go to Bruce Perry's childtrauma.org website. Quick picture of a child who desperately couldn't start a session without big body movements. And so he would get the pressure from jumping on the mats, and he would do it over and over in this kind of repetitive way. And after getting that sensory input, much more able to calm down. And then we could sort of go up to the next level and then go up to limbic. Here's another list. Again, this repeats some of what was on Dr. Foley's slides, but maybe a few other ideas. Weighted balls, vests, blankets, turtles, weighted turtles. There's a weighted turtle you can buy, all of which I learned from Dr. Foley. And then the idea of these games. So Simon says, but also games that have to do with starting and stopping, going slowly and going really fast, and being really loud and then being really quiet. All of which is about physiological self-regulation. So this was just an intermission, so to speak, to say that the body work is much more important than we give it, than we learn about, or that we give it credit for. And that when we're talking about trauma-exposed children, I think it's absolutely critical to know this, particularly for little children.
Yes, of course, Freud a long time ago said the ego was first and foremost the body ego. And I think, what Erica is speaking about is how children use their bodies and how they have to get themselves into the optimal zone of regulation. Neither tipping over the top nor so underregulated that their arousal isn't, they're not available to activate themselves. So managing anxieties and fears, giving the child some language. Mom and dad don't get along, but they both still love you. Talking through a puppet, and so on and so forth. Positive self-statements have a place certainly in some part of the treatment, and help to, in a sense, strengthen the child's ego. I want to talk about turning passive to active, because this is, I think, in my mind, a very, very important part, particularly in trauma treatment, where the child can enact and to some other object and show you what has been done to them. In a sense, they can be the aggressor. Now, I understand it's a kind of dangerous place, because obviously we don't want children to get fixed here, and we don't want them to identify with the aggressor. But this is often, in my experience, a turning point in the treatment. And it was the turning point in that little boy I talked about who had the fear of the toilet and the shark. And the turning point was when in play, he started to turn the shark on a figure that was the father. And it really was the turning point, in the sense that we began to realize that the father was actually, there was domestic violence in the home. Now that is, and the mother was also in treatment with a colleague, but that didn't come out until much later. I mean, it was not she didn't start there, nor did the child start there. They started with the child's symptom. But when the child could begin to turn passive to active, then the child told us, in a way was telling us what the father was doing. And in a way, we could say that his own symptom was a resistance. It was a resistance against really looking at the reality and looking at the fear he had for the father and the ambivalence. I mean, both the love and the hate. And so his conflict about it got transformed into the shark and the fear in the of the toilet. But again, when he could enact it, that began to be the door that opened, that he could tell that in fact there was violence and fear that he would be hurt and his mother would be hurt. So transference is a phenomenon, first of all, that is a human phenomenon. It occurs in everyday life. Edwin Glover, who used to talk a lot about transference, used to use this example. How many of you ever met someone you instantly liked or someone you instantly didn't like? Well, that's probably transference. You don't know anything about them. So transference, this is a pretty classical definition, refers to the way in which patients, the patient's view of and relations with his childhood objects, usually parents or important caregivers, are expressed in his current perceptions, thoughts, fantasies, feelings, attitudes, and behavior in regard to the analyst or the therapist, right? So you can imagine with this little boy, at some point, I mean, he had some anxiety about me. Would I turn against him? Would I be like the father? And so that fearfulness would crop its head. It was probably a transference reaction from that fear that he had the father. Usually transferences or distortions of the real relationship, and they're aspects that don't really fit the relationship. So I was not a menacing figure, nor in any way would I hurt the child. And yet there were obviously transferential reactions to me and concern. Now, this is a minor technical point that Anna Freud makes. She says that with young children, there's more a displacement rather than a true transference, meaning there hasn't been enough time lapse from early experience till now. It hasn't been processed through the unconscious and the conscious. So with young children, it's probably not a true transference. It's actually they're taking their real experiences, wishes, conflicts with their real parents, and they're displacing them to us. It doesn't have as much of the elaborations and the convolutions that a true transference would have because of it being over time and having unconscious implications. So there are various kinds of transferences or displacements that you will see in treatment. Transference of habitual modes of relating. For example, the child who's always used to taking their shoes off at home. Well, and when they come to the therapy room, they'll likely take their shoes off and wonder why I maybe will or will not. That's a transference of their habitual modes of relating. Transferences from their current relationships. And in this case, this little boy's turning the shark against the father, turning passive to active, was then his beginning to displace in play and tell what had happened at home. And then, of course, transference of past experiences, and the transference neurosis is really pretty much in adult treatment. We really not see that so much in the child, where there's the real reenactment of the past conflicts in the present, because very often with young children, they're not so much in the past, they are in the present, as with this little boy, and being afraid of his violent father. So children play, and their play speaks to us. So as Sally always used to say, Sally Province, the child will always tell you. It may be in code, but it's our job to decode it. And of course, this is no simple process, and we don't always get it right, of course. But here are some of, I mean, this could be a whole course and supervision in and of itself. But here are some of the kinds of clues we look at to find what the play might be telling us. So, of course, the child's affects. What are the dominant affects? When do certain feeling states arise? What is the child emotionally interested in? But are there certain objects that they withdraw or they have negative affects about? So we want to look at always what is the emotional valence when they're playing with particular kinds of objects. So again, here with this little boy, the shark was an object of fear, but then it became an object of actual aggression and with a certain delight, if you will, of turning this shark against the father. Of course, what does the child tell us verbally, and what are the themes that are enacted? Are the themes one that have to do with nurture? Are the themes ones that have to do with holding on and letting go and control? Are they ones that have to do with competition? So we want to look at the themes. And of course, we always want to look at what are the recurring themes? What tends to come up over and over again, and in what sequence do they come up? And the dramatization of the themes, meaning, again, are there certain sort of body dimensions to it? Are they oral? Are they about getting and taking in? Are they anal? Are they about holding on and letting go? So again, going back to the body and what bodily zones are being expressed. And then, of course, children create little objects. They create little experiences with their objects. And what is the arrangement? What's their organization? Does it imply some conflicting forces? Is there always one object that's never a part of the group of animals, for example? Who's the outlier? Why are they the outlier? Are they the outlier? So again, we want to look very carefully. And we talked about this last time, but Erickson makes much of when the play changes, when it changes in theme, when it changes in emotion, when it changes in content. And his notion is that often you will have a play disruption when the play gets too close to the conflicted material, because you're getting too close to the fire, right? And that's when the play will often change. And then there is a disruption, which he suggests is the counterpart in waking life of the anxiety dream, when in the dream the material gets too close to consciousness and we wake up and the play gets too hot and the child has to change it. So I did say that in traditional models of play therapy, interpretation is one of the primary mutative factors. It's one of the tools, one of our tools. It's in our toolbox, how we think change occurs. So an interpretation is usually a verbal intervention. It's intended to direct the child's attention or consciousness in a particular way, usually toward or away from some conflicted ideas and feelings. And the aim is to help them promote discovery of the meaning of their play and what the origins might be. So, of course, the child turning the shark against the father, of course, was very powerful about the origins of his fear. Was not really the shark. It was really of his father. But of course, we don't start there. we don't go, and this is a little bit of a difference, and Erica will talk about that. We tend to wait, and sometimes we wait too long, I have to say. I know Alicia said, we go on and on and on until the child is ready. And sometimes we don't have the gift of time. So interpretations are of different kinds. Narration is an important one. It's putting into words, it's transforming direct expression of impulses into expression through thought or fantasy. So the child can be getting, exercising, increasing control. That shark seems very angry. He really wants to bite. It seems like he just is he can't stop himself, right? So we're putting into words what the child may be showing us through their enactment.
So Dr. Foley, continue talking about interpretation, but at this juncture where we're sort of we're talking about narration, I wanted to just stop for a second and think about the use of narration. Dr. Foley was describing it as a form of interpretation, and it certainly is. In trauma work, narration also takes on the quality of bearing witness. And I pulled the Merriam-Webster definition, which is amusing, but it's actually incredibly perfect, to show that something exists or is true, to make a statement saying that one saw or knows something. Literally bearing witness to the truth of the experience. And so that when you're doing trauma work, sometimes the most simple narration, right? Oh, I see that the cow is hiding from the lion. Oh, I see that those dinosaurs are really fighting, right? And I'm not even using feeling words. I'm literally narrating the event. Oh, the ambulance is driving into those cars. Just my ability to speak what the child is playing, to verbalize it, conveys to this child all the things that Dr. Foley was talking about. I am watching, but with trauma, it literally takes on this quality of, I am with you. I can see your truth. I believe you that this happened, and I can tolerate your story and your feelings. Alicia Lieberman has used to say that they need to know, the child, the caregiver, that they are not alone, that we are not afraid of being with them in that moment, right? In that moment of terror, and that we will help them find wholeness. So we receive the message and we communicate back, I accept the message and this is a safe place, and I validate and bear witness to your experience. So it's an important subtlety about the way that narration can be used in trauma work.
So I think the putting into words is a very important idea. And Anna Freud said, my father once remarked on the philosopher Kant, who said that the man who first hurled a word of abuse instead of a spear at his enemy was the founder of civilization. That is really what analysts are aiming to do in getting patients to verbalize. And I think as Erica said, that's really a kind of beginning, is that narration. And I think it also says to the child the value of words, and someone just said, yes, it is quite validating. So again, to think about kinds of interpretations, observations, and Erica, in her sample, I just saw you put it, the object a certain place, is an observation. You're not interested in the blocks today and your thoughts seem to be somewhere else. You're not trying to find meaning in it, you're just stating. So here, I think the observation is very close to a clarification, very close to a narration. Clarifications, again, with children, the task is often to correct the faulty reality which has been registered earlier due to the child's immature perceptual and cognitive capacities. For children, I put it this way, children will often add 2 and 2 and get 8 because, their cognitive processes and their perceptions aren't yet well formed. So again, often trying to correct their misinterpretations and their understandings of certain experiences. And so clarifications can be important. There are, of course, connective statements. And I think a lot of connective statements can be connecting the past and the present, but they can also be connecting the experience and the affect. And I think this is another important dimension from a very traditional point of view in terms of trauma, is that often in trauma, the individual will remember the historical event, but what they don't, of course, recall is the emotional experience that went with that historical event, because that's what's too terrifying. And it is often by putting the affect back together with the experience that really begins to have the desensitizing, curative kind of effect. So one might be, maybe you don't want to talk here about what dad does at home, because that make you feel like a tattletale and worried and frightened that dad might get even. And this actually was with that little boy with the shark. Again, trying to put his own fear of dad and trying to reunite the fear with, again, maybe what he doesn't want to talk about, but what he showed me when that shark, went after dad and made dad the victim instead of making him a victim. In very traditional treatment, now here again is where I think there is some difference in the way that Erica works. In traditional psychodynamic work, we interpret from the defense to the dynamic. In other words, we don't go right to what we believe is the operative conflict or what is at work. We try to help the child to understand why it's so hard to hear or why it's so hard to say. Again, every time I talk about your visits to see your mother, you cover your ears. Again, I had that one about you didn't like what I said, so maybe the child won't want to go there. And then, of course, interpretations of the transference or the displacement. You wish I could be there to help you get dressed and lend you an umbrella. The child, wants us to be like maybe a very nurturing parent and maybe cross the line and do too much of it. Or you're a little worried. You think maybe I could be like that shark and I'll come after you. When the child expressed fear of me, expressing the displacement from the father to me. And then, of course, ultimately, but of course, this comes very slowly. We don't just do it. And it's not like it's a once and done thing. So forget the movie idea of interpretation of content or dynamics that you interpret and suddenly there's like a burst of light and insight, and then the person is cured. Can we go back to and many, this was the operative interpretation for this little boy. Your worry about the shark in the toilet might really have something to do with your fear of daddy's anger might hurt you or mommy. And of course, that's what he was really fearful of, but it was too frightening to go there. And he feared retaliation from the father, of course. And something that this theme comes up a lot in the psychoanalytic literature, but my colleague, Dr. Serena Weider, often asks us to think about this. For what is the symptom a solution? For what is the symptom a solution? And for this little boy, the solution for the fear of his dad and the fear of being the victim and his conflicted feelings was to transform the fear of dad into this shark, right? So the symptom itself was both a solution and a kind of resistance to the truth. So this idea then that, insight is very, very important. It is an important thing, and insight is significant, but it's not sufficient. And I think people really have misunderstood psychodynamic treatment for a very, very long time. Now, Freud did hold on to the idea that that insight would cure for a long time. But as analytic methodology moved on, began to realize that insight is the beginning, it's not the end. And this is where I think cognitive therapies and psychodynamic treatments cross here. So once you have insight, the question is, what are you going to do with what you now know to help you be different, right? So we have to apply what we know. But I think as in Erica's point too, we don't start there from the top down. We discover from the bottom up. And then once you have a cognitive insight with feeling, then starts the working through. And the working through is really an application and a practice. It's working through reflects an elaboration and an extension of the relevant interpretation in different contexts and directions, leading to the gradual integration of new knowledge and patterns of behavior as the process of working through proceeds. Sufficient working through has taken place when the child has moved to the next level of development and established himself. So the little boy who began to know that it really wasn't the shark he was frightened of, it was really dad. Now, had to think about, well, next time you go to the toilet, remember, what are you going to think about? That shark may come up again, but what do you know? And how are you going to help yourself in that situation? So we help the child or the adult to use what they know to help them manage the fear or the anxiety or the victimization. And this is a very important part of the treatment, and it's often a lengthy part of the treatment. Now, this treatment with this little boy went for a year and a half. I saw him weekly. At some stretches, I saw him bi-weekly. And once we started the working through, and the symptoms began to abate. And then, of course, there is the last phase of the treatment, which is the termination. Now, of course, some questions we always want to ask ourselves are, can the child cope on her or his own? Are they ready to do that? Have they given up excessive degrees of defensiveness? Does the child show a reasonable prospect of moving on to the next developmental stage? So again, we started out with that this kind of work is rooted, has grounded in development. So for this little boy, the next step was going to be to start to go to school, right? And that was to start, in a sense, to move to latency, when he could start to put some of this competition, this kind of fear. Of course, in his case, it was exaggerated because the father really was a fearful object. But could he put it to rest enough? Could he get his inside, calm enough that he could now start directing his attention to peers and to learning? So that really was a question. And it turns out he was then beginning to be ready to go to school. Now, these are just some ways in which maybe to deal with the termination. Again, I want to go back to, this is where this idea of a child having a box with their own special things in it is very useful at termination, because you can go back and open your box and look at the things, and you can review the course of treatment and talk about, if you remember what happened when you made this and what you were feeling. So it's a very, very useful way to sum up and organize. And one thing I have found effective, particularly in our age when we have computers, is to help the child know that they can evoke the memory of the therapist. They can evoke the memory of the comfort and the support and the insight. So, your mind is a little like a computer screen, and you can bring up pictures and memories of me and what I said in your head when you're missing me and in our time of playing together. So helping the child to know they have internalized aspects of the therapist and the treatment, and through evocative memory, they can bring it up to help themselves during inevitable times of stress or conflict in the future.
Okay. So if you think of this as an additive model, as I often like to say, what Dr. Foley just reviewed are, in fact, how we think about some of the things we think about and some of the techniques we use with termination. If you layer on top of that trauma, and what does termination look like in a trauma treatment? I wrote here some of the goals, the trauma-related goals of child-parent psychotherapy. And if you read down them, you will see that they are about resolving the impact of the trauma, right? So responding more realistically to threat, being able to differentiate between reliving and remembering, being able to verbalize, being able to place that experience in perspective, what we often call integration. That the child knows by the end of this treatment that they weren't to blame, it wasn't their fault. But most importantly, that there has been in our case, co-constructed with the parent, a mutually meaningful trauma narrative. But trauma narratives are throughout all trauma treatment. You will not find a treatment that does trauma that doesn't have some degree of work on trauma narrative, and embedded within that, by the way, prolonged exposure, which is considered an essential component of treating trauma. We also would like to see, in CPP in any case, improved parent-child attachment and all of the components of that relationship. And the other thing you want to see is effective arousal and affect regulation capacities, right? So presumably we've linked affect and experience because they were disconnected, and now we have reconnected them, and the child now has also been able to practice, and I would like to re-emphasize that point. Insight isn't enough. You must be able to practice the insight, so to speak, and you also have to practice affect regulation. And we want to increase, when we do dyadic work, for example, we want to increase the caregiver's capacity to help the child regulate. Little children, right? 0 to 5. We'd also like it if they were older. And then the last thing we want to do when we're terminating is we want to remind children and caregivers and families that, the future will hold trauma triggers. They will be out there. They will happen again. And to expect them, and how will you, right? Much like what Dr. Foley was just saying about, like, so if you're ever, sitting on the toilet and a shark seems to be coming up, how are you, what do you know? How are you going to handle that? It's similar. We think about how will you respond to a trauma trigger, and can you know now that you can survive that, and you will understand what's happening to your body and to your mind, and that you will have some tools and some skills for downshifting, for decreasing arousal. Okay.
If I could just jump in, so there's something you said, this idea of affect arousal, I think is very, very important. But I just want to point out that affect, particularly in young children, affect arousal and sensory arousal are closely allied. And I think Erica made that, Dr. Willheim made that point with her use of using physiological regulation, because, I just quickly, people use the word affect, a feeling and emotion as if they're synonymous. They're really not quite. Affect is the physiological arousal that is the antecedent, just like in sensation. That's the common root. They both have physiological arousal. So the physiological arousal becomes feeling when it breaks through to consciousness, and you can identify that physiological arousal as fear or as love or as sadness. It becomes emotion, and this all happens instantly. It becomes emotion when that feeling state then evokes an array of associations and memories to it. So again, affect, feeling, and emotion.
Very important, interesting. Okay, thank you. All right, so now we're going to sort of come towards the conclusion, where we're going to talk a little bit more about more trauma-specific ways of thinking about play therapy. So remember that in the previous webinar, we talked a lot about, we used Eliana Gill's model of dynamic sort of positive post-traumatic play. And then we talked about sort of a toxic negative post-traumatic play, her concepts. And And she says that when you have the sort of dynamic version of this play, you really can use a completely unstructured, non-directive approach. And I am more here thinking about individual work in some ways than I am about dyadic work. But the point here is what Dr. Foley's been talking about. Like, can you wait for this material to emerge? And the answer is, if it seems like the play is going somewhere, then yes, you can wait for the child to organically bring the trauma material forward. How do you do that? You follow the child's lead. You're doing that kind of narration, right? You're bearing witness. You do not tell the child what the characters are feeling. Oh, he must be scared. No, you don't know that yet. You may know that in time, but you can't presume that the cow is scared. The cow may feel something else, and aren't you interested to know what? So you begin with not saying, oh, it must be this, it must be that. The kinds of interpretations that Dr. Foley was giving were within a treatment that had been ongoing. He knew this child quite well, and he knew that what he was saying was 99.9% accurate. But we want to leave space. So we want to ask, we want to wonder. So what does the cow feel? I wonder what the cow is thinking. And don't be worried if children don't answer. They don't have to answer. We are modeling a kind of reflective way of approaching meaning and behavior. And then I might say, well, and then what happened? Well, then what happens, right? So also children assign therapists roles, right? You be the fireman. Well, I don't always know what I'm supposed to do as the fireman. And rather than decide what I'm supposed to do as the fireman, I like to use what I have always thought of as the film director technique, which is that the child is really the director. The child is directing the film. And all you have to do is lean over and say, what is it I'm supposed to be doing? What should the fireman do? Right? This kind of stage whisper. And every single time the child will lean back and say, you're supposed to rescue the little puppies. Oh, I'm supposed to. Okay, fine, right. And then you go back into play.
I just want to say, that takes us right back to using projection, of course, because the child's filling in the blanks, right? But we're creating it.
Yeah, and we join the child there. We join the child in that metaphor. We're going to talk more about that in another second. We use interpretation in the service, in some senses, in trauma work, of creating a trauma narrative, because we're getting closer and closer to the thing that happened, or we are in fact describing the thing that happened, but sometimes metaphorically speaking, right, thematically. I do want to mention, I just feel sort of ethically bound to say that if you're engaging in psychotherapy with a trauma focused, or really any early childhood psychotherapy, but particularly trauma, you really want to have had some training, and you really need to be in ongoing clinical supervision. I just think that's an important thing to say. So here's the problem with a completely non-directive approach. The problem is that avoidance is pathognomonic for PTSD. What is this big, fat, fancy word, pathognomonic? It means that it is in some ways the essential descriptive quality of the illness. It is a characterization that is absolutely quintessential to this illness. And PTSD, in addition to hyperarousal and re-experiencing, but avoidance is absolutely one of the central criteria. And that's a problem. And then it becomes a further problem if the child is playing it out, but not getting anywhere, what Gil called toxic play. So if we are just reliving instead of remembering, then I remind you of this slide from the previous lecture. It has this re-traumatizing quality. The kid is stuck. They're not achieving mastery. They're not relieved. Their symptoms are actually getting worse. So what do we do in that case? Well, now we maybe really do need to take a directive approach. And again, you want to do this if you've had training, you want to do this under supervision. So the first thing we want to think about is the body, which we've now said so many times that I'm sure it will be seared into your consciousness, which is a good thing. We want to decrease arousal, because there really is not going to be much happening cortex-wise, right, in terms of thinking, if the body is overly aroused in fight, flight, freeze. We want to talk about the fact that what is happening happened in the past. It is not happening now. This is a really important feature of trauma work. Sometimes it's the kind of thing that you want to whisper when someone is dissociating actively, right? That I know you got scared, you went away in your head, but it isn't happening now. Right now and here we are safe. That doesn't mean that someone, believes you and is cured, but it's an important concept. There's no way to teach how to do this kind of work in a 90-minute webinar, but I refer you to Theodore Gainsbauer, who is in many ways one of the fathers of early childhood trauma treatment and is absolutely brilliant. And if you want to think and know about what early childhood trauma symptoms look like and how you might treat them, I recommend you, and these articles are all listed in the reference section at the end of this slide deck. But what Gainsbauer does is he actually introduces trauma-related toys. He introduces the topic. He puts it front and center. He may even tell, so he'll pull out the car, right? The child was in a car crash and, puts a little boy on top of the little car and moves the little car and then says, oh, uh-oh, right? And brings another car. And yes, there are multiple possible outcomes for this, right? Child can go screaming into their mother's lap and cry. That happens. Don't worry about that, right? But this is an essential difference between a non-directive and a directive approach. And the idea that it's like ripping the Band-Aid off in some fashion, although you're doing it carefully and you're doing it thoughtfully, and you have to know how to titrate. So you have to know when a child has had far too much and you need to stop. And you cannot keep going. And you also need to know when it's time to regulate with music or movement or something like that, right? Other thing you can do is that you tell a story that is not exactly the child's story, but that has a theme of the child's story. So I often pull out the feelings puppets. And I have the crying feeling puppet and I have the angry feeling puppet. And I have the crying puppet say, I'm so sad. And I have the angry feeling puppet say, you don't get to feel sad, stop crying, right? Which is not a specific trauma, but it may be a reenactment, if I think it's a reenactment of some theme, something the child has experienced. Trauma books, most people will eventually ask about this, like, oh, well, can I use, the book, The Terrible Thing That Happened? And Chandra Ghosh-Ippan has a bunch of new books as well. And my answer very quickly is you can use a trauma book if you already know how to do trauma therapy. If you do not know anything about trauma therapy and you use the trauma book instead of your clinical sort of knowledge and judgment, then you may run into problems because you won't use the book to full effect, or you may not use the book at all. You may just like read it and boom, we're done with that. That is not, the effective way of using a trauma book is to interweave it into the treatment and to really work within a page, right? I also wanted to just quickly note that those of you who do CPP, you know that our first session with a child is, we're not waiting for anything. We walk in the door and we say, hello, I'm your therapist. And then we say, mommy and I have been talking and mommy has told me about the scary things that happened in the house. And, or may say the scary things that happened, or not even scary, but mommy has told me about when daddy hurt mommy when they were fighting. And mommy has also told me that now you can't go to sleep at night unless mommy is lying next to you, and that you don't like to leave her alone. You want to be with her wherever she is, and that you are getting into fights in school. And mommy and I are thinking that you may be having all of these big feelings and not be able to sleep and getting into fights because of what happened. And mommy wants you to feel better and to keep you safe. And so we are here together, and this is going to be a safe place where we can talk and play about what happened and all your big feelings. Now, that is like as far away from not talking about it and waiting for the child as you can possibly get. So why do we do this? And I just think it's worth a second to sort of stay here and think about this. We do it because we're modeling speaking the unspeakable. We literally walk into the room and essentially we are saying to this child, yep, we can talk about it. And I can only tell you after years of doing this, that some children there's going to be a variety of responses. Some kids are going to run across the room and hide. Some kids are going to then turn to all the bins of toys and dump everything on the floor. And some kids are going to turn around and look at you like, thank God, why didn't anybody else say this sooner, right? Or they jump in and they say, yes, that's what happened, and da-da-da-da, and daddy hit mommy, and then the ambulance came, and they're right with you. We also want to immediately set up a framework where we are connecting, right? Again, affect and experience, but we are also connecting symptoms to what happened. We are establishing a trauma framework that is going to guide our treatment. You know that in the NCTSN, the core trauma principles, right? We are moving from what happened, what's wrong with this child, to what happened to this child. And so we're setting that frame right away. And the other thing is that it's so important to immediately set the frame that the caregiver and the therapist are here to help, that there is hope, and that the caregiver wants to be able to protect the child. So it's a very brief summation, but I think it gives you a flavor maybe for direct intervention.
I just want to comment on that if I can a little bit. You know, I think that first of all, I'm not trained in CPP. I know about it. I have a lot of respect for Alicia, and I really have a great deal of respect for the model. I just want to say in the more traditional approach, of course, it's not totally non-directive. I mean, at some point, because I've obviously communicated with the mother's therapist, you know, with permission, I knew there was domestic violence in the home. And our position would be, obviously, if the child could approach it, they wouldn't need the symptom and they wouldn't need the defense. So we're not totally passive, but we start, of course, providing safety and support. And then we start interpreting the defense until the child, of course, no longer needs the defense. And then that's when the turning point, he turned passive to active. But I would agree. Sometimes I think we wait far too long. So I think there's, a lot of merit.
Well, it all depends on the child. I'm mindful of the time, so I'm going to sort of try to cruise through the next two slides a little bit so that we have at least a little bit of time for questions. This is just a slide that basically thinks about how close, and Dr. Foley was talking about this. So this is true not just for trauma, but it's especially true for trauma. How close can you get to the central, to the what is it called? The bullseye of the target. So are you doing a first person direct interpretation? Like, I wonder if you are showing us how mommy and daddy were fighting, right? Or am I saying it to the caregiver? I wonder if the child is showing us something that he remembers. Oops, sorry. Or am I moving to what we think of maybe in some ways as a second person interpretation, which is within the metaphor? Wow, seems like that dinosaur is really scaring the cow mommy and the babies. They can't seem to find any place that it's safe. It looks like the dinosaur always finds them. And then a third person level, which again, Dr. Foley did mention this. A lot of children who see their mommies and daddies fight have big feelings in their bodies, and sometimes they can't stop moving, or they worry all the time about their mommies. Now, if you say to me, well, how do I know which to use? The answer is, it depends. It depends on this child. It depends how long you've been in treatment. It depends like what hour you are in, what minute you're in of the treatment hour. And it also depends on what the response has been in the past to the things you have said. So sometimes if I say, I wonder if you are showing us how mommy and dad are fighting, there's tremendous relief. And sometimes if I do that, a child is going to stop playing and walk to the other side of the room. So it really is always about sequence. It's about what they played first, second, third. It's about what anyone said. It's about what mommy looked like. It's about, and so this is why you can't do this treatment. You can't teach this in 90 minutes. It's enormously nuanced in terms of how is what I'm going to say going to land, as we sometimes say in CPP.
And if I can just say, we didn't talk about this a lot, but it's very important. Of course, you use yourself. What feelings are evoked in you? And you use those as clues because to guide you about where you're going to be on this bullseye. And, this is a sort of listening with the third ear, attuned to your own feeling states and your own reactions and from your own clinical experience. So that's another powerful dimension of using yourself.
Absolutely. The last slide, I am not even going to read this, but the point of the slide was merely to say that when you talk about transference in the dyadic therapy space, it really gets rather complicated because caregivers have transference to the child, to you, you have countertransference to the child, to the caregiver, also to the relationship. The child has feelings. Gil was talking before about displacement rather than transference proper. So there's a lot going on in the room. I'm going to actually stop here because I don't think that talking about transference is totally necessary. And I'm going to back us up to the slide, and I guess we could take some questions. Yeah? Does that sound okay, Dr. Foley?
Yes, absolutely.
Yes. Okay. So Evelyn, I'm going to just trying to move us back to, I don't know how to do it otherwise. Sorry, guys. There we go. Okay.
So let me just start by thanking both of you for a very comprehensive, informative 2 webinar series. And for those who may have missed the first session, Kevin did chat in the link into the chat box, and you can also go to the TTAC website to past events, and you will see both the webinar recording as well as the PowerPoint. I also wanted to encourage everybody to please complete the survey, which is also in the chat box. And we're going to take a few minutes for questions, a lot of questions and not that much time, but one of them is what would you recommend as a first step to becoming a skilled play therapist?
Supervision, supervision, supervision. It's really, as far as I know, the only way you learn it. It's a very inefficient and expensive form of learning, but I really don't know. I mean, you have to learn the concepts, but I think you learn it by doing it and having supervision.
Yeah, I would say that the first thing I would, on my way to becoming a play therapist, I would make sure that I really understood dynamic psychotherapy. And a lot of the analytic institutes offer like 2-year postgraduate programs in psychodynamic psychotherapy, and some of them even have subspecialties in child. And I think that's a really good and important place to go, because if you aren't familiar with any of these concepts, it's even harder to do them.
Terrific. Somebody asked the question, considering the rise in gun violence, are toy guns recommended for the aggressive play toolkit?
Ah, what a good question. Here's the reality. It freaks out most adults. So no, nobody puts toy guns into their toy thing. If I were alone with a child and not with a traumatized caregiver, I would consider it. I will tell you that I use fake toy handcuffs, which has some issues as well. But children use handcuffs in a variety of ways, not just in a negative way. They use it actually to show attachment. Now, guns might be a different question. So the other thing is, look, children for millennia have been creating phallic objects out of sticks, so they don't actually need a toy gun.
Exactly.
So, yeah.
Excellent point. So somebody has the question, would narrative therapy and Gestalt therapy also be supportive modalities with play therapy for co-construction of transference and countertransference?
I don't know enough about Gestalt therapy, honestly, to answer that. So
I think that, I think that mixing and matching therapeutic modalities is not always, it depends. Like I support merging somatic therapies into the dynamic therapies because of the trauma factor and because you need to be working in the body. I don't know enough about narrative work or Gestalt work to say, but I also think you need to be clear about what you're doing or it definitely won't work. So just as the clinician.
So we've reached the end of our time. I really wanted to thank both of you. This has been just so incredibly informative. Again, I encourage people, please go back and you can review both the PowerPoints as well as the webinars. And please do take time to fill out the survey. We really rely heavily on it in terms of shaping our upcoming presentations. So thank you so much, Dr. Foley, Dr. Willheim. This has been really incredible.
Pleasure.
We really appreciate it. Thank you.
thank you. Thank you, Eric.